So over to you, Steve. You have to unmute.
We've had quite a good discussion so far, so I'm going to put up my PowerPoints, and just to comment on what comrades have said. I think everything I've said has been said already in different comments. You know, there are different things that comrades have said are all complementary or supportive or an expansion of what I'm about to say. So I'm just coming at it all from a slightly different angle. There was one question came up: is the social monarchy and social monarchism or monarchist socialism the same thing? I think that came up, and possibly not. I mean, I think the social monarchy is describing the post-war society that George was just talking about. I was also born into, although I'm younger than George, but nevertheless, that's the society that we are, that came out of the Second World War. And it's very important to, in my opinion, to get this this idea as part of our critique of where the left needs to go. So we do need that. I think social monarchism is more like an ideology because all of these things are ideas about socialism, false ideas, so the things that we're talking about, but they're out there, and we have to deal with them. So, short introduction, and obviously because on the call we've only comrades who are really in the group anyway. So I'm talking to comrades that we're already talking to. There's not like new people coming on here today. So I'm going to talk about many different socialisms. I'm going to bring in 1917. I'm going to ask the question, what is socialism? And then I'm going to talk about capitalist socialization as an idea, nationalization, democratization, bureaucratic states and democratic republics. And if we ever get time, it'll be back to Bismarck again, which I mentioned last time. But if we ever get to that point, we'll be exhausted. And I should just say that my first actual PowerPoint was this one. And you can see, hopefully you can see that, because I don't think I can see all that PowerPoint, was just to go to where George ended up, by the way, which I think is exactly what we're doing. In a way, for most people on the left, republicanism and socialism are like two separate things. I put in there, and, you know, like you could have republicanism and you can have socialism as if they're two separate things. I think we're working towards a concept of a republican socialism. But nevertheless, we've started this educational series by concentrating on republicanism. We've been ignoring socialism, more or less. And then we talked about republicanism, we talked about the Republican state, then we got onto the crown, then we got onto the union, then we got onto the social monarchy, and then we're coming back towards socialism. So socialism's coming into the picture. And I noticed last week, I think George was pleased when he realized socialism. Some people were getting worried that I was only going to talk about republicanism and then we just become pure Republicans. But I think in the dialectic, we have to really get at republicanism to understand it first. And we have to really work on that, you know, in order to reunite it with socialism in a different way. So the left tends to see republicanism, socialism separate, and our task here is to find out how they can come together in a way. And George's point, if they come together, republicanism is still at the front of the queue. Republican is the political and socialism is the economic. And this is political economy. And we're putting politics first by putting republicanism first. What we're saying is we need to go down a political route to get us towards socialism, whereas the economic power is. So I think that republicanism, socialism, we've historically been separated as well, but that's another story. We haven't got time for now. But anyway, so that's just so we've got round the right-hand side here towards talking about different kinds of socialism. Right, so my next point is, what is going to be my next point? Oh yes, I know where I was going to go. The next point was many different socialisms, because we've thrown out lots of different phrases, like bureaucratic socialism, like republican socialism, like monarchical socialism, all these other terms. And so I looked at the Communist Manifesto. I'm not going to go into all of these, but if you look in the appendix at the back of the Communist Manifesto, Marx outlines a whole load of socialisms there in this little appendix. This is in 1846, when he was writing the Communist Manifesto, 1846, 1847. He talks about reactionary socialism, feudal socialism, petty bourgeois, true socialism, German socialism, and then he has conservative or bourgeois socialism, and ultimately critical and utopian socialism. Now, I'm not going to go in to try to understand or explain all of those. I think the real point is that these socialisms are quite clearly not really socialisms. You know, they're something reactionary that's dressed up as socialism, something that's got a feudal element to it, which is dressed up as socialism. So what Bismarck might be doing might be kind of a feudal element, but he's presenting themselves in a kind of socialistic way. So that's the contradiction. Bureaucratic socialism can't be socialism, and in my opinion, neither can monarchical socialism, but we need to identify those ideas in order to tackle them, in order to understand them and tackle them. So many different socialisms. So I thought I'd start, therefore, rather than go through all these different types and just say, we can look at them and discuss them. My sort of first real point was to go to 1917 and all that. And that came up, obviously, in the discussion. It isn't far from what comrades have said. I'm not really going anywhere. Nobody's already been in the discussion before we started. And it was interesting, I thought, that the first point was, I was looking at the title of the Russian state in 1917. And it turns out on the 1st of September, before the October Revolution, it was called the Russian Democratic Federal Republic. That was the official title of it. And it kept that title a bit longer. But it became and what was the date? 3rd of January 1918, it changed its name to the Russian Soviet Republic, which was defined in the resolution of being established on the principles of a free union of free nations as a federation of Soviet and national republics. And interesting, we've been talking about unions, free unions, federalism, and so on. We talked about that on previous occasions. You can see that if you wanted to get the reference, I've got reference for that, but won't waste time with on that at the moment. Is in Lenin's selected work. But anyway, the republic they're talking about is the kind of thing we're talking around as well, by the way, because you could say that the Soviet Republic was a social in the sense that it always referenced the peasants and the workers and the soldiers. So in that sense, it was a kind of social republic in a certain sense. Nobody was claiming, by the way, in January 1980, that it was socialist. Lenin didn't say that either. They recognized it was still capitalist, but it had the most democratic kind of state during the period of the First World War. And I referenced that because I wanted to also reference the Labour Party's Clause 4 that comrades will know. But remember the Clause 4, because it was done at the same time, November 1917, Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb, certainly Sidney, probably Beatrice, because they tended to do things together, drafted this famous clause that was written in the Labour Party membership until Tony Blair took it away. And of course, you remember it says to secure for the workers by hand and by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible on the basis of common ownership of the means of production, distribution, exchange, and the best possible system of popular administration control of each industry and service. Now, that's taken to be the socialist clause, but when you put these two things together, the Russian one's talking about, it's got the word republic appearing in it all over the place. So they're thinking of a former state, whereas the Labour Party Clause 4 doesn't have any republicanism in it at all. It doesn't mention that idea. It doesn't mention really that idea of democracy at all. Now, we know in our thing that in the Labour Party conference, I think it's 1920, because I didn't double check it, but it's in our first position paper, takes the point that the Labour Party discussed the monarchy in 1923 conference, and that's the only time they've ever really discussed it, and they voted down significantly by a large number anyway. 38,000 people voted for it, about 3 million voted against it. So by 1923, in that period from 1917 to 1923, we could describe the Labour Party as monarchist socialism as an example of that, because that's really what their programme, that's essentially what their programme, and you can see therefore that programme becomes 1945 where it comes. But another interesting connection I realised was that I looked into Sydney and Beatrice Webb, you know, the Fabians, famous for their being the leading voices in the Fabian Society. And they wrote, and just check my notes on this, they wrote this book called The Constitution for a Socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain. Now you think that sounds pretty socialist, for a socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain. And so, fair enough. So when you look in there to see what they're talking about, how the economy is going to work, how politics is going to work in this socialist Commonwealth of Great Britain, it turns out they've got a whole section on what role the king would play. So what does the king do according to Sydney and Beatrice Webb? So look at this. Well, they said on page 62 of this pamphlet, it's an essential feature of the British Constitution that our sovereign king reigns but doesn't rule. You know, so he reigns, but he doesn't reigns but doesn't rule, and he holds his title by Act of Parliament, and then which they describe then as a contract of service between the British king and the British people. And it's the function of the king, or his duty is not to exercise governmental power, but merely to the performance of a series of rites and ceremonies that then charm to the historic continuity of the political institutions of the British race. Oh, race, watch out. So where are we going to go with that? And I think there's something else I saw. I think Beatrice Webb might made some other racist comments, but that's another story. I'm not going down there. But the thing was that they could conceive of the idea that you could have a socialist commonwealth, you could have clause 4, but you could still have a king. And they wrote this it was commissioned, by the way, this thing they wrote was commissioned by the Secretariat of the International Socialist Bureau to report on the socialization of industries and services. It was commissioned internationally to write this thing. And they must have imagined that the whole world would want to have a king. If they were going to be socialist, you know, if this was going to apply to France, they'd have to bring their king back, you know, to get to this model of ideal socialism. And so I wrote, well, what happened next? And this is kind of interesting. So they became Baron and Baroness Passfield. So that works. You know, obviously they joined their lordships. So obviously they liked the king so much, and the king must have liked them, that they became a Baron Passfield. And then the other thing that then happened, quite interesting, was in 1932, they spent 2 months in the USSR. And they went back in 1933 to the USSR. And then in 1935, they wrote The Soviet Communism, a New Civilization. It had a question mark in the earlier version of it. So they were just posing the question whether this was a new civilization. And then in a later version, the question mark disappeared. They decided it must have been a new civilization. But again, the same thing. When they observed the Soviet Union, they were having a democratic bypass, because they clearly weren't seeing any democracy. There was no more democracy in clause 4, and there wasn't seeing any democracy in what might be called Soviet communism. So I wondered to myself, this was just a point at the end, I wonder if we could describe Stalin as a kind of red czar, you know. In other words, Soviet Union was a kind of bureaucratic socialism, or even a monarchical socialism, with Stalin being the kind of red czar, you know, because that would have been perfectly fine for Sydney Webb to have gone that. He wouldn't have seen that a contradiction at all, you know, the idea of something like that. So there is an idea, here was an idea of monarchical socialism. The Webbs and the Fabians and people like that were still conceiving of their socialism within the framework of the British monarchy, of course. And it didn't occur to them. So if they saw Stalin as a dictator, there was no problem with that as far as they were concerned, because the means of production was state-owned. That was where they got to. So, leaving that aside a little bit as a kind of an example of that, and going to ask what is socialism, quite a thorny question of which there are many opinions. So I just thought I would throw my sixpenneth in on this, you know. So lots of people have different opinions, but I wanted to just give a particular take on it, which I think makes sense to me, and it may make sense to you. I don't know. We'll see. Well, one could think of it as being, you could think of Marxism even, or socialism, a theory of the socialization of capitalism. And they're socializing is that capitalism, okay, is socializing the world. That capitalism is a process of, now what does it mean if we said that capitalism is socializing the world? It's the same way that Marx talks in the Communist Manifesto about the revolutionary transformation that capitalism is bringing to the world. Well, it's organizing things, it's planning things, it's standardizing things, it's creating abstract labor, and it's creating a universal class. It's creating right across the world a class of wage workers who are carrying out this laboring task. So capitalism is socializing. Capitalism is socializing the world. So you could say that socialism, a working class theory of socialization would be arguing that this socialization, which is already going on, is already taking place under capitalism, through the development of capitalism, should be carried out by the working class. That if the working class can take control of this process and oust the bourgeoisie from controlling this process, because the capitalist class is sitting on this process for its own private profit, for its own benefit, and being driven by the laws of capital accumulation. So it's a question of transfer for the working class, gaining power for a process of creating a global world economy that's already taking place. And that then leads us back to all the ideas about republican democracy, with the importance of democracy in all of this process. Profit and exploitation driven by the law of value. This way which capitalism is socializing the world is having disastrous consequences: boom, bust, the destruction of the planet, all those other things that you all know already, so I won't repeat them. But anyway, so I thought I'd ask myself, the next question for this is to ask some about the accumulation of capital, and ask something about the forms that this accumulation takes place. Because this is what Engels and Marx talk about later on. Engels talks about it and Lenin talks about it in State and Revolution. So I was thinking of these different forms. First one is self-employed. You could be a self-employed person. If you're self-employed and you're not really, you're not employing anybody, it's not really capital. You're just self-employed. You've got your own tools and equipment, but you're not employing anybody. But if you move up, if you move up a notch as a sole trader or partnership, and you've now got wage labor, at that point you start to become a very small capitalist enterprise, the lowest form of this socialization chain. And then if you move up from this sole trader, where capital is associated with the individual themselves, you know, if I set up my own shop, it's my shop, it is me, you know, there's no difference between the shop and me. If you move to the corporate form, the family firm or the public corporation, there you've now got the corporate form. So the business exists now independently of individuals. It's become slightly socialized. Now, McDonald's, whoever first invented McDonald's doesn't really matter, because it's being run by a whole load of other people. The people who invented it are probably long since dead. It carries on. It's got a life of its own. It's become almost a person in itself. You could almost think it's a corporate citizen that exists in the world as an independent entity. And then you could think of monopoly capital, where these corporations grow to become control the whole economy, or maybe when a few big companies control the whole economy. Or then you move on to state monopoly capitalism, where the state starts to take control of some of this capital. And we mentioned all the examples. In 1945, the National Coal Board, British Gas, the NHS. Well, these are all examples where the state has become almost the monopoly supplier, but they are now state-owned. And then the final form is the multinational corporation that comrades talked about before. So the way to think of this is that as capital accumulates, planning and organizing is going onto a giant scale. The whole world is becoming socialized through these different forms. Now, this process that's going on under our noses, under our feet, as it were, gives rise to people saying, oh, this state monopoly is a kind of socialism. So it gives rise to people saying, I think John mentioned managerial, you know, you're going to bureaucratic and managerial. People have started to think, well, this is not really capitalism anymore, because managers are in charge, not the form of private owners. Or this is not really capitalism anymore because the state is in charge of it, etc. So So what I'm arguing, as capital becomes more socialized on a bigger and bigger scale, it's more difficult to understand its private character, even though the profit is being privately expropriated and it's privately controlled. I'll come back to what Engels says about this in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, because he deals with this, and he also deals with this process when he's talking about Germany in the 1880s. Okay, so far, moving on then. So I came to this point then. So I think then that would allow us to make a distinction, therefore, and I think we should make a distinction between nationalization and democratization. Nationalization being state ownership, democratization being the extension of Republican democratic organization in the workplace. So you could include under that heading of democratization going on, workers' management, which you would have in a cooperative, where the workers are now starting to elect their managers. Or where you've got, even in a private company, a degree of workers' control, where you may have got a shop stewards committee. So they're not actually running the management, but they've got a degree of power because of the union organization in that workplace that I'm sure that George would be telling us about if he was working in a car factory, for example. So I would come back to thinking that this socialization process that capitalism is carrying out under our feet, under our noses, it is only really carried out when the means of production are nationalized plus democratized. You have to have these two elements. Now, again, comrades have said that. Then what's the problem with the NHS? Well, it is nationalized, but it's not democratized. Though Karl was saying that maybe there was some democracy among the doctors at the beginning, and then Russell was coming back and saying, no, it's a bureaucratic exercise. So our view of socialism, democracy has got to figure into our understanding of socialism, which is the route back to republicanism, because we're bringing into the story the ideas of republican democracy and the importance of republican democracy in any idea of socialism that we've got today. So just to emphasize that socialization is a process going on, and it can be intervened in through nationalization and democratization processes. Okay. Let me then come back to, okay, so I then had this little chart. Hold on a minute, I did this little diagram. So I had a little diagram here, which was about ownership, control, and wage labor, and I think that was it. So if we've got private capital, we've got private ownership on the first little block on the top left hand there, okay? What is control in a private business? It's bureaucratic. By bureaucratic, I just mean power coming from the top down through the management structure. Power is concentrated at the top and it comes down to the workforce. Wage labor, yes. State capital, what's state capital? Where the state is the owner of the means of production and control is bureaucratic coming from the top down, it's still wage labor. If you're working for the NHS, it's still wage labor. If you're working for the National Coal Board, it's state-owned, bureaucratic management, it's wage labor. It's still a form of state capital. And then I think this last one we've got here, I'm thinking to myself that if we have what I'd rather call public ownership and democratic control, in other words, that the workforce begin to control what's going on in the workplace, they begin to elect their managers, then we haven't really got wage labor wage labor is beginning to disappear almost, because the workers are becoming like the owners. They're coming into this point of control of the workplace, as in a cooperative. You know, in a cooperative business, it's not a simple capital labor situation, because in a cooperative enterprise, the workers are the co-owners of it. They're being paid, of course, that's true, but they have that degree of control over what their decision. So I think, therefore, coming back from that to say that, well, the Soviet Union, we could call it bureaucratic socialism. Trotsky called it that. And we could also use the term state capitalism. They don't contradict each other. They're just different ways of looking at the same thing. Bureaucratic socialism is emphasizing this point of socialization when the means of production were taken into the hands of the state. But state capitalism emphasizing that wage labor is still there the workers are not in control. The workers are not controlling the means of production. They are wage slaves. They're not liberated free people. And so it goes back to then Sidney Webb could go to Russia, see the bureaucratic socialism, and think it's completely consistent with the idea of having a king. No reason at all why you couldn't have that. Okay, I'm not long to go now, comrades. Is that all right so far? Probably 2 more slides, and then we'll stop. Okay. I now wanted to go back to previous slides that we had. Okay. Which one's going to come up? That one. Do you remember this one from before when we were talking about how we picked out states? And I had my simple idea: the monarchist states could be autocratic and liberal, and I need to give a few examples there. We've had this PowerPoint before. I'm just reusing it or reminding you of it. We had Tsarism, North Korea, Saudi, Spain, UK, Denmark, all different autocratic or liberal versions of monarchical states. And then I preferred to call the others, which may be called republics, I prefer to call them presidential states. They can be authoritarian, they can be liberal. But again, what they have in common with the monarchist state is that power is coming really still concentrated at the top. We could have Myanmar, where we've got a military dictatorship, it's a republic. Belarus, Russia, Germany, USA, you've got lots of these examples. We call them republics, but I'd rather call them, I think, more accurately, presidential states where bureaucracy is still there. And then we were finally at the end talking about republican states where democracy is coming from below. And we had talked about some about the Paris Commune, which George and Maria are going to be talking about from there when we do their thing on Marx, on their thesis on Marx, which goes into the Paris Commune on detail. And I was talking a little bit about the Russian Republic 1917-18. So the next one was to do this. Do you remember? So that was my diagram, really. We've got bureaucratic states, whether they're monarchies or they're presidents, whether they're called constitutional monarchies or republics. The key thing about these states, these bureaucratic states, is that executive power, kingly power, comes down through the civil service, through the security services, through the armed forces. There may be a parliament with these. We may have elected assemblies. There may be the citizens or subjects may be electing people to parliament. There's an interaction between the citizens, the elected assemblies, and the bureaucracy. But they are all in essence bureaucratic states run as top-down states. And then I was trying to contrast that with the idea of a democratic republic, which is my next one, which was to bring that up, was to try and capture that idea that the thing about a republican state is that the people are sovereign, that power must come up from below into democratic assemblies. The executive must be controlled by those assemblies. The citizens, we could call it a citizens' army. It's not a standing army, a bureaucratic army. And even that the public services, the administrative functions are, in the way I've done the diagram, they're part of the people. They're not part of standing above the people, controlling the people. So we were contrasting bureaucratic states and republican states. So I arrive at the point of saying, if any of these bureaucratic states takes things into public ownership, then you've got something you could call bureaucratic socialism. It's something which is coming from a bureaucratic state. Now, that bureaucratic state could have included Stalin's Soviet Union as well. And so the kind of socialism in Russia, in the Soviet Union, would be bureaucratic. It would be state capitalism. It wouldn't be democratically organized. So coming back then to my final point, which is to come back, comrades, to the last one, which is to come back to Bismarck's bureaucratic state socialism or monarchical socialism. Now, I mentioned this before, so I'll just go back over that. Remember that in the 1880s, Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor of the Kaiser, was Iron Chancellor, came up with a program. In 1883, he came up with a program. He brought in a Sickness and Insurance Act, he brought in accident insurance, he brought in factory legislation, safety legislation for factories, he brought in labor exchanges, and he also brought in some nationalizations of the railways. And Ferdinand Lassalle called this some kind of, he wanted to do a deal with Bismarck, and he saw this as a kind of march towards socialism. And Marx and Engels poured absolute scorn on this idea, which they called the social monarchy, and they called monarchical socialism. Those were the terms to sort of to say to the working class movement, don't have anything to do with what Bismarck didn't call it socialism, by the way, just what he was doing. But in the working class movement, there were strands of people who thought this was an advance towards socialism. So I'm going to finish with a quote from, if I can find the quote, hold on a minute. The quote that will tie all this together from, hold on a minute here. Yes, I've got a quote from Engels, and I'll finish on this point, which was, he says that he makes the point, and he's writing in this pamphlet called Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and he says, capital grows and becomes more concentrated. And he goes on to say, it grows either into joint stock companies and trusts or into state ownership. This does not do away with the capitalist nature of the productive forces. In joint stock companies, he says, and trust, this is obvious. Nobody's going to think that's socialism. And in the modern state, and he says, on the modern state again, is only the organization that bourgeois society takes on in order to support the external conditions of the capitalist mode of production against the working class, he goes on to say. The modern state, he says, no matter what its form, is essentially a capitalist machine, the state of capitalists, and he says the ideal personification of total national capital. It's almost as if you bring that capital together, it's almost become the national, the personification of the nation, if you bring it all together. He says the more it proceeds to take over the productive forces, the more it does actually become the national capitalist, and the more citizens it exploit. The workers remain wage workers, proletarians. The capitalist relation is not done away with. So what he's making the pitch to say that pure state ownership, nationalization, doesn't do away with capitalism. It's this form of socialization that capitalism, the appearance of socialism, when in fact it isn't. And he adds a footnote, which just slightly amused me, so I'll go with a footnote, and then I will finish. He goes on to say, this is a footnote. Since Bismarck went in for state ownership of industrial establishments, a kind of spurious socialism has arisen, degenerating now and then into something of flunkeyism, and without more ado declares that all state ownership, even of the Bismarckian sort, to be socialistic. Certainly, if taking over the state of the tobacco industry is socialistic, he says, then Napoleon and Metternich must be numbered among the founders of socialism. He dismisses all ideas. He then goes on to dismiss all ideas that state ownership is socialism, citing the Belgian and Prussian railways. And then he says, he fins by saying, otherwise, the Royal Maritime Company and the Royal Porcelain Manufacture and even the regimental tailor shops of the army would also be socialistic institutions. And even as was seriously proposed by a sly dog under Frederick William III's reign, the taking over by the state of the brothels, he says, would be the same sort of thing. So he goes to that point. Even state brothels would be socialism, you know, if you could follow that through, as well as the Royal Maritime Company, all these other things. So he's making here the point of understanding the process of socialization of capitalism, but it doesn't get rid of capitalism. What the missing element in all of this is the democratization of the process. It's only that democratization which takes us back to the idea of a republican socialism, which puts its emphasis on having a republican state, having a real democratic state. Our first task is to get a really democratic state, and that opens the way to the democratization of the means of production, not just the Clause 4 type idea of monarchical socialism as it was. And I'm finishing there. And I'm going to go out of, stop the sharing. I will, just to say, I will circulate the PowerPoints if that's any use for comrades.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was quite brilliant, I think.
Yeah.
It really, that really explains how things should work. You know, that vision that I was asking for. I think, you know, that goes some way towards explaining that vision. But two questions immediately spring to my mind.
Hold on a minute, Carol. You've got to get your pen. Right, get far away. Yeah, go on.
Two things immediately spring to mind is, will people actually want to run their workplace? Will they have the desire to do that? How are we going to persuade people that that's what they would like to do? The other thing is, it's only actually work. I mean, you're the only two examples where this marvelous, I mean, I think it's absolutely marvelous ideas and structure. The only place that it's worked is in the Soviet Union from 1917 to 18 and in the Paris Commune. Mm-hmm. It's only worked in those two places in all of history, recorded history, as we recorded history. So how are we going to make it work? It doesn't seem to have been a big hit, up to this point in time. So where do we go from here? How do we make it work?
I mean, I could answer that now, but I think we should take other comrades. Karl, do you want me to answer you now with that, or shall I take more comrades? Shall I just answer what you said, or shall I take what the comrades think?
I wanted to try and answer that.
Yeah, okay, then I'll shut up. I'll shut up then in that case.
Russell's got his hand up, so yes.
Because I actually saw Carol's comment in the chat, which sort of prompted a reply. And it's actually it's a very important question, and I don't know if people has anyone heard of Slavoj Zizek, the philosopher, Hegelian Marxist philosopher from Slovenia, very, very famous guy. And he at a talk I attended some time ago, he kind of raised that question as well. He said, look, people aren't interested in running the show. They just want decent services. They want, know that their kids can be educated, that they can get good health care, that they can get a well-paid, decent job, etc., etc. But I think he's right and he's wrong. And it takes me back to Carol's question, and it takes me to Steve's talk. We need to draw a distinction between bureaucratic and bureaucracy, which brings in the Weberian analysis of capitalism. You can never do away with the bureaucracy. You will always need a bureaucracy, but the mediating feature is democracy. So in a way, we're not asking workers, I don't want to, as an academic, I don't want to run, and as a trade unionist in an academic institution, I wasn't interested in running the institution, but I was interested in those who do run the institution are made accountable to the interests of those who work in the institution. So I think the answer to Carol's question is, I think if people are told that they will have a say in running, they will decide how their institution is run, but they won't have to be the bureaucrats who actually carry out the wishes of the workers. That's how I understand. That's how I resolve that very fundamental and important question. Because you're right. I don't want to have to kind of all the bureaucratic rigmarole, and it's all nonsense to me. It's not what interests me. in the least, but it's got to be done. So you need a bureaucracy, and I think people misunderstand the difference between bureaucracy and bureaucratic, or the bureaucracy becomes bureaucratized if it's no longer accountable. I see Steve shaking his head, so
I couldn't. Sorry, Russell, I couldn't resist. I'll put my mute on. I can't resist shaking my head because I'm going to.
I quite like that, Russell. That sort of does answer it for me, in that you're going to be choosing your leaders and they'll be accountable to you, but you're not going to have to do the actual bureaucracy yourself. I think that's a good answer. Thank you. George had his hand up next, but Steve, do you need to come back in now or not?
Right.
Steve,
Can you hear me?
You muted.
Other comrades come in, because although I'm desperate to answer these questions,
No,
I think it's good. It's
unmuted.
good to let other comrades come in and have a go. So I'm going to shut up now and let George or other comrades have a go, because they might answer it before I get a chance. You know, that'd be fine. I can go to sleep then if they do. Go on.
George was our next one, so I'm
Can you hear me?
George.
Yes.
Yes, loud and clear.
Capitalism is under crisis at the moment. So therefore, what we're going to see is a movement of the monarchy, in inverted commas, both attempting to bolster its image and to be used by the crown machinery to draw the subject peoples towards the monarchy. And that's one trend I see. The other thing is we haven't discussed all that very much, is we're undergoing a form of globalization whereby half the population is now excluded for various different reasons for selling their labor power. Mm. And if you listen to the people in power, they're already saying that those that are producing what they would call immaterial labor are of no use or no consequence to society at large. Those that are producing labor, which is very, very much an increasing minority, but with increasing power, you know, are relevant. These are the points that I wanted to make to try and fit in the discussion. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, George. Mari, you were next. Over to you.
Yes, hello. Now that was splendid, Steve. I must say I have not absorbed everything, but I will need to go back to this again and again. I saw somewhere you mentioned the Citizens' Army, and I wonder why is it formulated that way, and I imagine that it's because all this transformation is done by struggle, which is against an enormous historic, absolutely overwhelming antagonism to democracy. And then I would be glad at some stage that we look into this, because probably Karl was concerned people are not going to want to do things. Why should they want to intervene at that level? And that would be probably because we are all subjugated, and our consciousness is arising from a situation of subjugation, which is, well, sends us into passivity, and passivity is the norm that's expected from us. And I will be glad if that gets investigated later. Thank you.
Thanks, Mari. That's really good. Yeah, I get that we're so sort of brainwashed into our position of subjugation that we haven't realized the potential that we have for controlling our own destiny. Excellent answer. John, over to you. You were next. Sorry, John, can you unmute yourself, please?
Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, in a way, I'm saying the same thing as Mari. I do think it's down to the psychology of individuals produced by capitalism. It's about the kind of individual psychology which capitalism and its education systems actually produces, which capitalism and its family structures produces, because a lot of this is to do with the exploitation of women within the family, and how the idea of nurturing a child does not necessarily include within the conception of parenthood and what parenthood should be, the actual encouragement of curiosity, the encouragement of independence from the parent. So it's all to do with psychology in my view, and the kind of psychology which we need to make a socialist society work is quite important, and without which I don't think that we can make the distinctions between a socialism which will work and the socialisms that have failed, which Steve's gone through.
Thanks very much, John. Another really great contribution. Thank you. So can we go back to Steve now to answer our questions?
We'll try to. So first one, Karl, if I get it right. So if I don't quite get it right, what you said, you can just remind me again, because I want to make sure I'm actually answering what you said. But I think, will people want to run? And will people want to run? And so I think that democracy is almost, socialism is something people don't really necessarily understand, but democracy is something that we do understand, even though our culture is an anti-democratic culture, because people want to control things. You want to have, every person wants to have some control over their life. It's a natural thing to do that, whether you go to work or you're in your local community. It could be anything from cleaning the streets to going to work and trying to decide what syllabus you're going to teach the kids, or how the discipline in the school. Any of these things, people want control, and the only way that we can get control of anything, because capitalism has socialized us, that was my point, that we have been socialized, organized, planned in this system. The only way we can do that is by doing it with others, by collectively. So we're forced by conditions to find allies, to find other people. And then as we find allies and we find other people, then we become democratic, almost in a certain sense. A strike being a classic case, if we have what is a strike but a crisis? Because we've fallen out with the employer of how much they're doing. But if we want to be effective in a strike, we can't all go off and do our own thing. Everybody's got to get together. We've got to try and have a vote and a decision. So democracy is the only way we can find, the only way we can know that we can collectively do anything. So it's, if you like, it's inherent in the situation. We're told, of course, don't bother, you just mind your own business, basically. Go to work, mind your own business, do as you're told, go home again. And maybe people, that's what we're taught. So that's maybe how workers are atomized, alienated, and told, don't bother. But life often says you've got to bother. You're forced by conditions, by circumstances, which was where George went when he took us into the point of crisis, which I never discussed at all. But this crisis point that George brought in, a global crisis of capitalism, the crisis of the social monarchy, and all these other things, that's what I want to discuss. That's where we want to bring in all this theory, if you like, back to where we are today, is where we're going next. In my idea, we're going to talk about the current crisis, which is where George is always in ahead of where we're getting to. So I think that's That's really important. That's the thing that. And what did you say? There was another thing you said, Carol. Something about destroyed can work. What was that you said? I'm sorry.
I said it's only worked in most of those.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
Examples where it hasn't worked, and we've only got two very short. I mean, the Paris Commune was a matter of weeks, wasn't it?
Yeah, but there are actually, I've just picked out, those are two that have jumped out to me. There's many, many more. They're only working because they're being crushed by the forces against them. But the fact that they've happened shows that it can happen. You can go back to 1649 and find out how the soldiers in the new model army were seeking to get rank and control over their officers. They had people called agitators. They elected their representatives. At the Putney debates, they were there arguing with the grandees of the top officers. And there was a test of who would control the new model army. And the new model army was the Republic. You know, if the levelers, these rank and file Democrats, as it were, if they'd won that argument, then we would have had not a bureaucratic republic, we'd have had a democratic republic. So I think there are many, many more examples to find. And those are just, the Paris Commune marks in discovering that, and it discovered an advanced point. I think the point about our socialism, it's not utopian in the sense that we can cite examples of already things that have happened already. We're not going to invent an idea of a perfect democracy that could work somewhere. We can look at concrete examples of human experience of what people have done. We can understand why it failed, but we can understand the source of it. So these are the seeds of our future. They are the moments, if we look at those moments, where we can see the possibilities that are there, you know. So you can, it's two-sided, Carol. They are failures, but they're also examples. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say. They're examples of how it can be. So I think that, so what I'd say is the desire for democracy is very widespread. Right, the desire for something called socialism isn't. There's only a few socialists who think, oh, we'd nationalize this, that, and the next thing, because probably capitalism is probably quite popular amongst the working class, you know, because apparently it's a sort of gives you a job and it gives you money and all these things. It's like a charity capitalism, you know, sort of for most of the time until it goes wrong. So capitalism is pretty popular with the working class, you know, but democracy is the thing that's really popular. You know, it's why Brexit was why they won the Brexit argument by stressing there about taking back control. You know, they're the only the Leave side who won that argument because they could mobilize people. We're out of control. We can't control anything. The Brexit will take back control, of course, which was bullshit. But you know, that's how they won the argument. You know, so I'd say that. Now I want to go on to Russell's point, which is important because I think Russell. There's an argument about what we mean by the term bureaucracy. In fact, I was discussing this with another person earlier on today. If we think administration is something that has to become, we have to administer things, we have to record things, we have to, you know, we can't test our students, for example. We don't keep a record of what marks they got or whatever it is. So there has to be administration. But I don't think administration will continue. There will have to be the administration of our work, of our planning. That's planning, you know, that's right. There's nonsensical there's nonsensical stuff where we're forced by the bosses to fill in stupid forms that we don't really need. And we're doing it because they've told us we have to do it, you know, but that's because we're wage laborers and we do as we're told. So a lot of that rubbish can go, you know, there's a lot of paperwork we don't need, but administration we need. But for me, bureaucracy is not the same as administration. Bureaucracy is about the power coming from the top downwards. The power is concentrated at the top in an institution, in a company, in a corporation, and it comes down through the managers who then tell us as workers what to do. The people telling us what to do don't really know much anyway. You know, the people who know what else is going on are the actual people on the ground who do the job. They're the experts, really. So it's the people who are not the experts telling the experts to do this, that, and the next thing. So I want to separate bureaucracy from administration. Under socialism, under what I'm suggesting is all bureaucracy will be abolished. That is, all top-down rule will be replaced by bottom-up rule from below, but there'll still be administrators. And Russell, although you enjoy lecturing or teaching people, the people who do administration, administering, they've got a job that they quite like, some of them doing that as well. You know, their job shouldn't be that we need people to plan our rooms, do this, that. So the whole thing, they're part of the collective effort that we've got in our workplaces to make the whole place work. And that's not the same as bureaucracy. Yes. I was going to make this other point. I think I'm back to George's point, I think. About crisis, a crisis that teaches us that we have to get democratically organized, you know, the crisis of capitalism. I mean, COVID tells us that every time we have a crisis, we suddenly realize how socialized this world is. You know, suddenly we depend upon transport workers, suddenly we depend upon all these things we didn't even know we depended upon them. We depend on a whole road of vital workers that we didn't know even were there. We didn't know they existed till the crisis came. Because the whole society has been made by capitalism so interdependent that we don't, and we're taught not to notice this. And we're taught to think you're just an individual doing your own little thing. And in a crisis like COVID or like any of these other things that happen, an economic crisis, banking crisis, suddenly we realize we're all dependent on everybody else. You know, we're dependent on the Chinese workers that we didn't even know we were dependent on. Or whatever, you know, all over the world, we're dependent on workers in other countries doing stuff all the time, which we don't. Capitalism just makes you think you're an atomized individual, not part of this collective world that's already there. So capitalism is, what I'm saying is capital. We're not inventing socialism. It's capitalism is making socialism necessary, possible, because we're getting there, but we haven't realized it. You know, it's like the realization that what's there is what we can make work. But we need this democratic component, as it were, this democratic organization of the working class to take back control, is a famous phrase. So we never hit the first, but take control anyway. That's it. I don't know if I've answered other points, but perhaps comrades will come back if I didn't, or make their own comments.
You've really answered all my questions, Steve. Thanks very much. And I would just say at this point, I know Russell's got his hand up, so I'll go to you in a moment, Russell. There's been studies done, and people who don't have any control at their place of work suffer much more from stress. You know, if you've got no control over your life or over the work you're doing, then you are much more likely to be stressed, and in the case of men, to commit suicide, in fact. So this desire to have control in your life is a fundamental desire and a very important one. So yeah, I totally agree with you. Russell, you have your hand up. Over to you.
3 points I want to make. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, well.
Yeah, I mean, myself and Steve, we're not really in disagreement. This is semantics. All I would say is read Weber on, I think the concept of bureaucracy is a very important one. I prefer to call the administration still a bureaucracy, but we're on the same, singing from the same hymn sheet as to what that entails and who controls it. So just in terms of examples of that Karl raised, further examples are workers' self-management in the former Yugoslavia. While there are certain critiques of it, nevertheless, they were workable models of workers' control of the workplace. And another example I can think of is from a book I recently read, but I think the author, certainly the surname, I think is Medhurst, and it's called No Less Mystic. It's quite a long book. It's a critique of Bolshevism and Leninism, but towards the end of the book, he cites contemporary examples where local communities control their communities democratically and control their workplace. It was a real eye-opener. If you continue a little longer, I'll try to fish out the book so that you can see what it is. It's a really interesting book. And the last point is, I agree with John very much about the question of psychology, and a lot of work has been done, and I've academically written a dissertation on the relationship between Marxism and psychoanalysis. So sort of the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser set in train a whole area of study about how you need to understand people's psychology, the people's unconscious, to understand how ideologies are generated and hold sway among individuals. So yeah, that's a very important area of study.
Thanks very much, Russell, as well. Right, there's no more hands up, so over to you, Steve, to round up, I would say.
Okay, rounding up, I just maybe emphasize that obviously a couple of things. One is that I will send out the PowerPoints for comrades so you can have a look, and we always do in our group, the next time we meet, if comrades have got other questions that haven't been addressed, they can bring it up at the next group meeting. So there's a chance to sort of follow that up. The main thing I think is I think that I wanted to do today was to get the connection between when we were talking about pure republicanism, we were talking about democracy and having a democratic state. There was a point that Marie said, she did ask me, and it's come back to me now, about why I'd used the word citizens' army. In talking about a democratic state, what we're really saying is there's no top-down bureaucratic standing army where power's at the top. It has to be, if you like, we have different terms for this. We could call it a people's militia. We could call it, the idea is that the officers are elected. It's almost like the New Model Army was in 1649 when they were trying to get to the point of electing their officers. So that, again, there's not top-down control, because top-down control allows the state to control people. So if you want to have an army that's not going to oppress people, it to be a citizens' army, if you like. It's the citizens getting together and learning the military things they need to learn to be able to defend that society. Okay, and to do those things that they need to do. So I think citizens' army was a term I use. You could use another term. I'm not stuck to that particular term, but it's just the idea that it's a citizens' force. It's not a professional army. Okay, it doesn't mean that you don't have experts in all the military things that you need to be experts in, but basically the citizens, almost what in this country we've got the territorial army, which is a kind of citizens' army. I mean, citizens' army exists in all sorts of places as well, you know. I don't know about the IDF, but they are citizens. I don't know how long they're in the army for. So there's lots of examples where you don't get a normal standing army. You've got citizens who become soldiers temporarily or are trained or whatever. It's not like a professional army that can be used as in Myanmar or any other place to suppress the people. So that's part of a democratic. It was in the American Revolution, that idea that you could bear arms, citizens could bear arms, is actually a democratic idea, that if you don't have a standing army and every citizen has a right to have a weapon and form a militia, a local militia, then that makes sure no central power can oppress you. Now, of course, it's become a slogan of the right, about the right of individuals to carry guns and things like that. But its original revolutionary idea of that was the idea that weaponry shouldn't be concentrated in the hands of bureaucrats and officers and so on, that then can be turned against the people. Otherwise, the people won't have any real power because they'll always be threatened by that. Going back to my original point was this. Okay, we were talking about republicanism as a democratic idea. So that's really with the idea of a republican state, and that's absolutely the crucial way towards socialism. And now we're taking that idea into the idea of socialism and separating any idea of bureaucratic socialism and in favor of democratic organization in the workplace, the democratization of work. That's where a republic, the republic, the social republic, goes from a democracy to the socialization of work. Okay, but not nationalization in that pure sense, in the democratization of that. And it's a process, so it's not something that would happen straight away. I think that's all I really want to say in summing up.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's been absolutely great. I've really enjoyed the discussions tonight. Really enjoyed the discussions. So I think at that point we've had a very good nearly 2 hours. So I think it's time to say thanks very much and good night.